When Outlaws shattered Catherine Moreau's legs and left her to die in the Wyoming dust of 1867, she thought her story was over until a mysterious hermit rancher discovered her broken body and refused to let her fade away. As Catherine fights to heal in Daniel Crenshaw's remote sanctuary, she must confront not only her physical limitations, but also the outlaws who return to finish what they started. But will she discover that her greatest strength was never her ability to walk, but her courage to stand and fight? The wagon wheels made a sound like breaking bones as they rolled across the rocky ground of Wyoming territory in August 1867. Catherine Moreau pressed her face against the hot canvas, watching dust clouds rise like smoke signals in the distance. Her stomach twisted with worry, not from the bumpy ride, but from the emptiness in her coin purse and the fear of what waited ahead. "Fort Laramie's just over that hill, miss," called wagon master Pete Jackson from his seat up front. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many hopeful faces turn disappointed at journey's end. "You got people waiting for you there?" Catherine touched the brass locket at her throat, the only thing left from her mother's jewelry box. "No, sir. Just hoping for work." She tried to sound confident, but her voice cracked like thin ice. At 19, she'd bet everything on this journey west after losing her seamstress job in St. Louis. The city had no room for another poor girl with calloused fingers and big dreams. The other passengers, a merchant family heading to California and 2 miners seeking silver in the mountains, kept to themselves. Catherine understood why. Out here, trusting the wrong person could mean death. She'd heard the stories in every town along the trail: outlaws, Indians, wild animals, and diseases that could kill faster than bullets. But she'd also heard other stories. Stories of women who'd built new lives on the frontier, who'd found worth in places where nobody asked about their past or counted their mistakes. Maybe she could be one of them. Maybe Wyoming territory would be kinder than Missouri had been. The wagon lurched suddenly, throwing Catherine against the wooden side. Through a gap in the canvas, she glimpsed something that made her blood freeze. Riders. At least 6 of them, spread out like wolves circling prey. They wore bandanas over their faces, but their eyes were visible, cold and hungry. "Mr. Jackson," she whispered, crawling toward the front of the wagon. "Those men." But Jackson had already seen them. His shoulders went rigid, and she heard him curse under his breath. "Everyone stay calm," he called back to his passengers. "Might just be cowboys." Catherine knew he was lying. Cowboys didn't ride in formation like that. Cowboys didn't circle wagons like buzzards waiting for something to die. These were the men she'd heard about in whispered conversations at trading posts, the ones who took what they wanted and left nothing but grief behind. The merchant's wife began to pray quietly in German. Her husband checked his pistol with shaking hands. The miners looked at each other and nodded. They'd been through this before. Catherine had never been through anything like this. She'd lived her whole life in cities where the worst danger was crossing a busy street. Now she was trapped in a wagon with nowhere to run, watching death approach at a steady gallop. The lead rider raised his hand, and the others slowed their horses. Catherine could see him clearly now, tall and lean, with pale eyes that seemed to look right through her. Even with his face covered, she could tell he was smiling, not the kind of smile that meant friendship, the kind that meant he enjoyed what was coming next. "Good afternoon, folks," he called out, his voice smooth as poisoned honey. "Beautiful day for traveling, isn't it?" Jackson's reply came through gritted teeth. "We're just peaceful travelers, mister. Don't want any trouble." The outlaw's laugh sent chills down Catherine's spine. "Oh, but trouble's exactly what we're here for. See, we heard you folks might be carrying something valuable. Something worth sharing with your new neighbors." Catherine's hands trembled as she clutched her carpetbag. Inside was everything she owned: her few dresses, some coins, and letters from her mother. Not much to anyone else, but it was her whole world. The wagon creaked as more riders moved into position. Catherine counted 8 now, maybe 9, all armed, all watching with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. "Please," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "We got women and children here. Take what you want, but don't hurt nobody." The outlaw leader tilted his head like a curious bird. "Well now, That depends on how cooperative you folks are. See, we got a reputation to maintain. Can't have people thinking we've gone soft. That's when Catherine noticed something that made her heart stop. Painted on the side of the leader's saddle was a symbol she recognized from wanted posters. A broken horseshoe with a snake twisted through it. The mark of the Brennan gang. Marcus Brennan himself sat on that horse, studying them like a cat studies a mouse. The most feared outlaw in the territory, wanted for robbery, murder, and worse. Men who crossed him were found days later, if they were found at all. And now he was looking directly at her. "You there, miss," Brennan called out, his voice cutting through the afternoon heat. "Step out of that wagon. Nice and slow." Catherine's legs felt like water. This was it. This was how her story would end. Not with the new life she'd dreamed of, but with violence and fear in the middle of nowhere. But as she reached for the canvas flap, something unexpected happened. Jackson cracked his whip, and the wagon horses bolted forward like lightning had struck them. The wagon exploded into motion, throwing Catherine backward as the horses charged ahead in panic. Behind them, she heard Brennan's roar of anger and the thunder of hoofbeats as the outlaws gave chase. Bullets whined past the canvas like angry wasps. "Hold on!" Jackson shouted, but his words were lost in the chaos of creaking wheels and pounding hooves. The wagon hit a rock and went airborne for a terrifying moment before crashing back down. Catherine tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Through the gap in the canvas, she saw the merchant trying to shield his wife and children as they bounced around like dolls in a box. One of the miners had his gun out, but he couldn't get a clear shot with the wagon jumping and rolling. The outlaws were gaining. Catherine could hear them whooping and hollering like this was all a game to them. A bullet tore through the canvas inches from her head, and she pressed herself flat against the wagon bed. "They're too fast," the merchant yelled in accented English. "We cannot outrun them." He was right. The outlaws rode like they were part of their horses, while the wagon was heavy and clumsy. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. That time came sooner than Catherine expected. The left front wheel hit a prairie dog hole, and the wagon tilted sideways with a crack like breaking thunder. For a moment, it balanced on two wheels, and Catherine thought they might tip over completely. Then it crashed back down, but something was wrong. The wheel was bent, and the wagon lurched with every turn. They were slowing down whether they wanted to or not. The outlaws surrounded them like a pack of hungry coyotes. Brennan rode alongside the wagon, his gun pointed at Jackson's head. "That was mighty unfriendly of you, old man. Now you've gone and made me angry." Jackson pulled on the reins, and the horses slowed to a walk, then stopped completely. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat and the heavy breathing of the scared horses. "Everyone out," Brennan ordered, "and no more tricks, or somebody's going to get hurt real bad." Catherine's legs shook as she climbed out of the wagon. The other passengers followed, their faces pale with fear. The merchant's youngest child was crying, and his wife held the baby close to her chest. Brennan dismounted and walked over to them, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. Up close, Catherine could see the cruelty in his eyes, the look of a man who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. "Well, well," he said, pulling down his bandana to reveal a face that was almost handsome, except for the coldness that lived there. "What have we got here?" "A nice little family, some working men, and—" his eyes settled on Catherine, "a pretty young lady traveling all alone." Catherine tried to make herself small, but there was nowhere to hide on the open prairie. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she could smell dust and sweat and fear. "Please," Jackson said again, "take our money, our supplies, whatever you want, just let us go." Brennan laughed, and his men joined in. "Oh, we'll take your money all right, and your supplies, but letting you go, that's a whole different problem." He nodded to his men, and they began going through the wagon, pulling out boxes and bags. Catherine watched them dump her carpet bag on the ground, scattering her few possessions in the dirt. One of the outlaws picked up her mother's Bible and tossed it aside like garbage. "See, we can't have witnesses," Brennan continued, almost conversationally. "Bad for business. People start talking, and pretty soon we got the law breathing down our necks." The merchant's wife sobbed quietly. Catherine felt sick to her stomach. She'd known this journey was dangerous, but she'd never imagined it would end like this. "But I'm not completely without mercy," Brennan said, with that terrible smile. "I'll give you folks a choice. You can make this easy, or you can make this hard. Either way, it ends the same." That's when Catherine did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped forward. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave the others alone. I'll go with you willingly." Brennan's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's very noble of you, miss, but you seem to misunderstand the situation. See, this isn't about taking prisoners. This is about making sure nobody lives to tell tales." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs. "Then why are you waiting? Why not just get it over with?" The outlaw leader studied her for a long moment. "Because," he said finally, "I'm curious about you. Most folks in your situation would be begging and crying by now, but you're standing there like you're ready to fight. That takes guts." "Or stupidity," one of his men called out, and the others laughed. "Maybe both," Brennan agreed, "but I admire it. Tell you what, miss, since you're so brave, you can watch what happens to your friends here. Consider it a reward for your courage." He turned to his men. "Kill the men first. Save the women and children for last." The outlaws raised their guns, and Catherine closed her eyes. This was it. This was how her story would end, watching innocent people die because she'd been too proud to beg. But the gunshots never came. Instead, she heard something that made her open her eyes in surprise, the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider was coming fast across the prairie, kicking up a dust cloud behind him. Brennan cursed and spun around. "Who the hell is that?" The rider was still too far away to make out clearly, but Catherine could see he was tall and wore a wide-brimmed hat. He rode like he was part of the horse, and he was coming straight toward them. "Could be law," one of the outlaws said nervously. "Could be trouble," said another. Brennan's hand moved to his gun. Only one way to find out. The stranger's horse stumbled and went down hard, sending its rider tumbling across the rocky ground like a broken doll. Catherine gasped as she watched the man try to get up, then fall back down, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his shirt, dark and wet in the afternoon sun. Brennan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Well, would you look at that? Looks like our visitor had himself a little accident." He turned to two of his men. "Go check him out. Make sure he's not playing possum." Catherine's stomach twisted as she realized the truth. This wasn't a rescue. This was just another person about to die because he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The stranger had probably been riding to Fort Laramie, just like them, and now he'd stumbled into their nightmare. The outlaws approached the fallen rider carefully, their guns drawn, but when they got close enough to see his face clearly, one of them whistled low. "Boss, you need to see this." "What is it?" Brennan called back, impatience edging his voice. "It's Daniel Crenshaw, the hermit from the North Range." Catherine saw Brennan's expression change. The cruel amusement faded, replaced by something harder. "Crenshaw? What's he doing out here?" "Looks like he was heading to town," one of the men reported. "Horse threw him when it stepped in a hole. Shoulders busted up pretty bad." Brennan walked over to where the stranger lay, and Catherine found herself following, drawn by curiosity, despite her fear. Daniel Crenshaw was younger than she'd expected, maybe late 20s, with dark hair and a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. Even hurt and bleeding, there was something steady about him, like a rock that wouldn't break no matter how hard the storm hit. "Well, well, Danny boy," Brennan said, crouching down beside the injured man. "Been a while since we crossed paths." Crenshaw's eyes opened, focusing on Brennan's face with obvious effort. "Marcus." His voice was rough with pain. "Should have known you'd be involved in something like this." "Something like what?" Brennan asked with false innocence. "Just having a friendly conversation with some travelers." Crenshaw's gaze moved to the terrified passengers, taking in their situation with the quick assessment of a man who'd seen trouble before. Friendly conversations don't usually involve 8 armed men and scared women. "Times change, Danny. People change." Brennan's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Remember when we used to be friends? Back before you got all high and mighty? Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. These two men knew each other, had history together, and from the way Brennan was looking at Crenshaw, that history wasn't pleasant. We were never friends, Crenshaw said quietly. We just happened to fight in the same war. That's cold, Danny. Real cold. Especially considering I saved your life at Chancellorsville. And I've regretted owing you that debt every day since. Brennan's face darkened. Well, today might be your lucky day. Today you might get the chance to pay it back. He stood up and brushed dust off his pants, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Catherine could see the calculation in his eyes, and it scared her more than his earlier cruelty had. Here's what's going to happen, Brennan announced to his men. We're going to have ourselves a little test. Danny here thinks he's better than us. Thinks he's some kind of hero living out there all alone on his ranch. So let's see just how heroic he really is. Crenshaw struggled to sit up, his face pale with pain and loss of blood. Leave these people alone, Marcus. Whatever beef you have with me, it's not their fight. Oh, but that's where you're wrong. Brennan's voice took on the tone of a man explaining something to a slow child. See, these folks have something I want. Their silence. And you've got something I want too, entertainment. He nodded to his men, and they hauled Crenshaw to his feet. The injured man swayed but managed to stay upright, though Catherine could see it cost him considerable effort. Here's the deal, Brennan continued. You fight me. No guns, no weapons, just fists. If you win, these nice people get to ride away with their lives. If you lose, he shrugged. Well, let's just say it won't matter much to you either way. Catherine wanted to scream. It wasn't fair. Crenshaw was hurt, bleeding, probably dizzy from his fall. How could he possibly fight anyone, let alone a healthy man like Brennan? But Crenshaw straightened his shoulders and looked Brennan in the eye. And if I don't fight at all, then I kill them anyway. And you get to watch before I kill you too. The silence stretched out like a held breath. Catherine could hear the wind whistling through the prairie grass and the nervous shuffling of horses. Jackson was praying under his breath. The merchant's wife had stopped crying and was staring at Crenshaw with desperate hope. All right, Crenshaw said finally, but when I win, you ride out and never come back to this territory. Brennan laughed. When you win? Danny, you always were an optimist. He started rolling up his sleeves. But sure. If you somehow manage to beat me, which you won't, we'll pack up and head for California. Scout's honor. Catherine doubted Marcus Brennan had ever been a scout, or that his honor was worth the dirt under her fingernails. But Crenshaw nodded like the promise meant something. One more thing, Crenshaw added. The lady gets to choose where she goes after this is over. Win or lose, she's not your prisoner. Brennan's eyes flicked to Catherine, and she felt like a mouse being studied by a snake. Awful concerned about someone you just met, aren't you, Danny? Just decent human behavior. You might want to try it sometime. That wiped the smile off Brennan's face. All right, hero. Let's see how decent you are when you're eating dirt. The outlaws formed a rough circle, pushing the passengers back to give the fighters room. Catherine found herself next to Jackson, who was muttering prayers and curses in equal measure. Brennan moved like a man who'd been in plenty of fights, smooth, confident, looking for openings. Crenshaw moved like a wounded animal, careful, defensive, favoring his injured shoulder. The first punch came fast, Brennan's fist shooting toward Crenshaw's jaw. But the injured man wasn't as slow as he looked. He ducked under the blow and landed a solid hit to Brennan's ribs. The outlaw leader grunted and stepped back, his expression shifting from amusement to annoyance. Lucky shot. They circled each other like wolves, and Catherine found herself holding her breath. Everything depended on this fight. The lives of everyone in their group hung in the balance, and their champion was a bleeding stranger who could barely stand straight. But as the fight continued, Catherine began to see something that gave her hope. Crenshaw might be hurt, but he was smart. He was using Brennan's confidence against him, letting the outlaw leader waste energy on wild swings while landing careful, precise hits of his own. Still, it couldn't last forever. Blood was running down Crenshaw's arm, and she could see him getting weaker with each exchange. Brennan was getting angrier, which made him more dangerous. Sooner or later, one of those wild punches was going to connect. When it happened, Catherine's heart nearly stopped. Brennan's fist caught Crenshaw in the temple, and the injured man went down hard. For a moment, he lay still, and Catherine was sure it was over. But then Crenshaw rolled to one side, avoiding Brennan's boot, and swept the outlaw's legs. Brennan crashed to the ground, and suddenly both men were wrestling in the dust, grunting and cursing as they fought for advantage. The crowd of outlaws was shouting now, some cheering for their boss, others just enjoying the violence. Catherine couldn't watch, but she couldn't look away either. Too much depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Dust clouds swirled around the fighting men like tiny tornadoes as they rolled across the hard ground, each trying to pin the other down. Crenshaw's injured shoulder was bleeding worse now, leaving dark stains in the dirt, but somehow he managed to wrap his good arm around Brennan's throat. The outlaw leader's face turned red, then purple as he clawed at Crenshaw's arm. For a moment, Catherine thought it might actually be over. Then Brennan drove his elbow backward into Crenshaw's wounded shoulder, and the injured man's grip loosened with a gasp of pain. Both fighters stumbled to their feet, breathing hard. Brennan's lip was split and bleeding, while Crenshaw could barely lift his left arm. They looked like two scarecrows that had been through a tornado. "Give up, Danny," Brennan wheezed, wiping blood from his mouth. "You're done. You know it, and I know it." Crenshaw swayed on his feet, but didn't back down. Not until these people are safe. Catherine's heart ached watching him. He was fighting for strangers, risking his life for people he'd never met before today. She'd never seen such courage, such stubborn determination to do what was right even when the odds were impossible. That's when she noticed something the fighters hadn't seen yet. In the distance, beyond the circle of outlaws and their horses, another dust cloud was rising. This one was bigger, moving faster, and it was heading straight for them. "Boss," one of the outlaws called out nervously. "We got company coming." Brennan turned to look, squinting against the afternoon sun. What he saw made his face go pale. "That's a cavalry patrol. How the hell did they find us out here?" Catherine's spirits soared. The cavalry meant rescue, meant safety, meant these terrible men would finally face justice for their crimes. But her hopes crashed when she saw Brennan's expression change from worry to cold calculation. "Change of plans," he snarled, pulling out his gun. "Kill them all, now, before the soldiers get here." "Wait!" Crenshaw shouted, stepping between the outlaws and the passengers. "You gave your word. We had a deal." "Deals change when the situation changes," Brennan replied, cocking his pistol. "And the situation just got a whole lot more complicated." Catherine watched in horror as the outlaws raised their weapons. The cavalry was still too far away to help. In 30 seconds, maybe less, she and everyone else would be dead. But Daniel Crenshaw had one more surprise left in him. Instead of backing away from the guns, he lunged forward, tackling Brennan around the waist. Both men hit the ground hard, and Brennan's gun went off, the bullet flying harmlessly into the sky. "Run!" Crenshaw shouted to the passengers. "Get to the horses! Go!" Everything happened at once. Jackson grabbed the merchant's wife and children, pushing them toward the outlaws' horses. The miners dove for cover behind the broken wagon. Catherine found herself running too, though she didn't remember deciding to move. Gunshots cracked through the air, but the outlaws were confused, unsure whether to chase the escaping passengers or deal with the cavalry approaching from the other direction. In that moment of hesitation, everything changed. The cavalry patrol came thundering over the rise. A dozen soldiers in blue uniforms, their sabers flashing in the sunlight. They'd seen the gunshots and were charging at full speed, battle cries echoing across the prairie. Most of Brennan's men decided they'd had enough. They leaped onto their horses and scattered in different directions, each man for himself. Only 3 stayed to fight, and they quickly realized they'd made a terrible mistake. The soldiers were professional fighters, trained and disciplined. The outlaws were criminals, used to picking on helpless travelers. When the two groups met, it was like watching a wolf pack try to fight a grizzly bear. Catherine found herself crouched behind a rock, watching the battle unfold. Smoke from gunpowder mixed with dust from the horses, creating a gray haze that made it hard to see what was happening. Shouts and curses filled the air, along with the harsh breathing of tired horses. When the shooting stopped, 3 outlaws lay dead on the ground. 2 others were wounded and captured. The rest had escaped, including Marcus Brennan himself, though Catherine had seen him holding his arm as he rode away. The cavalry sergeant, a grizzled man with gray hair and kind eyes, approached the surviving passengers. "Everyone, all right here? Anyone hurt?" Jackson stepped forward, hat in hand. "We're alive, thanks to you soldiers and this brave man here." He gestured toward Crenshaw, who was sitting on the ground, still bleeding from his shoulder. The sergeant knelt beside the injured man. "I know you. You're Crenshaw from the North Range. What happened to your shoulder?" "Horse threw me," Crenshaw said simply. "Hit some rocks." Catherine stepped closer, drawn by something in his voice. He wasn't telling the whole truth, but she couldn't figure out why. The sergeant seemed to accept the explanation, though, and began examining the wound. "We'll get you back to the fort," the sergeant said. "Doc Morrison can patch you up proper." "What about the passengers?" Crenshaw asked, looking around at the scattered group. "Are they safe to travel?" "Their wagon's busted, but we can fix it well enough to get them to Fort Laramie," the sergeant replied. "You did good here, Crenshaw. Real good." Catherine watched as the soldiers helped Crenshaw to his feet. His face was pale from blood loss, and she could see he was fighting to stay conscious. But when their eyes met across the dusty battlefield, she saw something that made her breath catch. He was looking at her like she mattered, like she was worth saving, like she was more than just another mouth to feed or burden to carry. In all her 19 years, no one had ever looked at her that way. "Miss," the sergeant called to her, "you got people waiting for you at the fort?" Catherine hesitated. She could lie, could pretend she had family or friends expecting her. But something about Daniel Crenshaw's steady gaze made her want to tell the truth. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I was hoping to find work there, as a seamstress or cook." The sergeant nodded. "Well, the fort's always looking for good help. You'll find something." But as the soldiers began organizing the rescue, Catherine found herself thinking about something else entirely. She was thinking about a wounded man who'd risked his life for strangers. About quiet courage and stubborn honor. About the way someone could change your whole world just by being willing to stand between you and danger. The prairie wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, promising a rough night ahead. But for the first time since leaving St. Louis, Catherine felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. She felt hope. As they loaded Crenshaw into one of the army wagons for the ride to Fort Laramie, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She was going to find a way to thank him properly. She was going to find a way to repay the debt she owed him. She had no idea that very soon she would need his help more than she'd ever needed anything in her life. 3 weeks later, Catherine found herself standing outside the doctor's office at Fort Laramie, clutching a basket of fresh bread and wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Through the window, she could see Daniel Crenshaw sitting up in bed, his left arm still wrapped in white bandages, but his color much better than when they'd first brought him in. "You can go in, miss," said Doc Morrison, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "He's been asking about you and the other passengers every day. Wants to make sure everyone made it through all right." Catherine's heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She'd found work in the fort's kitchen and had been living in a small room above the bakery, but she couldn't stop thinking about the man who'd saved their lives. Every night, she dreamed about the fight in the dust, about the way he'd stepped between them and certain death. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said softly, pushing open the door. "I brought you something." Daniel looked up from the book he'd been reading, and his face brightened when he saw her. "Miss Moreau, how are you settling in at the fort?" "Please, call me Catherine." She set the basket on the small table beside his bed. "The work is good. Mrs. Patterson in the kitchen has been very kind to me." "I'm glad to hear it." Daniel shifted carefully in the bed, wincing as his shoulder reminded him it wasn't fully healed yet. "I was worried about you, about all of you, really. It's not easy starting over in a new place." Catherine sat in the wooden chair beside his bed, smoothing her skirt nervously. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did out there. You could have been killed. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Catherine said firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have looked out for themselves first. You're different. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the window. I used to think I was done looking out for other people. Thought I'd paid my dues during the war and earned the right to live alone. What changed your mind? You did. All of you. Daniel's gaze returned to her face. Watching Brennan terrorize innocent folks, seeing that little girl cry. I remembered why some things are worth fighting for. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest. The soldiers said you knew him. Brennan, I mean, from before. Daniel's expression darkened. We served in the same unit during the war. Different men back then. Or at least I thought we were. Marcus was always a little too eager for a fight. A little too quick to take what he wanted. But I never imagined he'd become what he is now. People change, Catherine said softly. Some do. Others just show their true colors when they think nobody's watching. Daniel looked at her intently. What about you, Catherine? What brought you all the way out here to Wyoming territory? Catherine hesitated. She'd gotten good at giving simple answers that didn't invite more questions, but something about Daniel's steady gaze made her want to tell the truth. I was working in a dress shop in St. Louis, she began. The owner's son. He thought I should be grateful for his attention. When I wasn't, I lost my job and my reputation. Nobody would hire me after that. Daniel's jaw tightened. I'm sorry that happened to you. It doesn't matter now. I'm here, I have work, and I'm safe. Catherine managed to smile. Thanks to you. Before Daniel could respond, the door burst open and Doc Morrison rushed in, his face grim. Crenshaw, we got a problem. 3 riders just came in from the North Range. They say your ranch is burning. Catherine watched the color drain from Daniel's face. Burning? How? There hasn't been lightning for weeks. Wasn't lightning. Doc Morrison said quietly. Looks like it was set on purpose. And there's something else. They found tracks. Lots of them. Whoever did this, they're still in the area. Daniel was already trying to get out of bed, ignoring the doctor's protests. I have to get back there. My cattle. My horses. You're in no condition to ride, Doc Morrison argued. That shoulder needs another week to heal properly. There won't be anything left to heal, for if I wait another week, Daniel shot back. He looked at Catherine with regret in his eyes. I'm sorry. I have to go. Catherine felt panic rising in her throat. It's a trap, isn't it? Brennan is trying to draw you out. Probably, Daniel admitted. But it's my land. My life's work. I can't just let him destroy it. Then don't go alone, Catherine heard herself saying. Take soldiers with you. Take help. Daniel shook his head. The army can't spare men to protect one ranch. They've got their own problems. He was pulling on his shirt now, moving stiffly but determined. This is something I have to handle myself. Catherine stood up so quickly her chair nearly tipped over. No, you don't get to save my life and then throw yours away. There has to be another option. Like what? The room fell silent as everyone waited for her answer. Catherine's mind raced, trying to think of something. Anything that might keep Daniel from riding into what was obviously a trap. Let me come with you, she said finally. Doc Morrison laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Miss, you're talking about riding into outlaw territory. This isn't a Sunday picnic. I can shoot, Catherine said, though she'd only ever fired a gun once in her life. And I can cook, tend wounds, keep watch. I won't be useless. Daniel stared at her like she'd suggested they fly to the moon. Catherine, I can't ask you to risk your life for my problems. You're not asking, I'm offering. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. You saved my life. Now let me help save yours. For a long moment, nobody said anything. Outside, they could hear the sounds of the fort going about its daily business. Soldiers drilling, horses neighing, women hanging laundry. Normal life continuing while they debated something that could get them both killed. It's too dangerous, Daniel said finally. Everything out here is dangerous, Catherine replied. At least this way we face it together. Daniel looked at her for a long time, and Catherine could see him weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, he sighed. If you come with me, You follow my orders without question. No arguments, no hesitation. Can you do that? Catherine nodded, though her heart was hammering with fear and excitement. Yes. And if things go bad, if shooting starts, you run. You don't try to be a hero. You just run. Promise me. I promise. Doc Morrison threw up his hands in disgust. You're both crazy, but if you're determined to get yourselves killed, at least take some medical supplies and extra ammunition. As they prepared to leave, Catherine caught Daniel's arm. Why are you letting me come? Really? Daniel was quiet for a moment, checking his pistol. Because, he said finally, I've spent 5 years trying to convince myself I don't need anyone. And you've spent your whole life being told you're not worth much. Maybe it's time we both found out we were wrong. The ride north from Fort Laramie took them through rolling hills covered in summer grass that stretched toward distant mountains like a golden ocean. Catherine had never been on horseback for so long, and every muscle in her body ached, but she didn't complain. Daniel rode beside her in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. They smelled the smoke before they saw it, a bitter scent that hung in the still air like a warning. When they finally crested the hill that overlooked Daniel's ranch, Catherine gasped at the destruction spread out below them. The barn was a blackened skeleton against the sky, still sending thin streams of smoke into the cloudless afternoon. The house appeared untouched, but the fences were broken, and there were no cattle or horses in sight. It looked like a ghost town, empty and lifeless. They drove off my stock, Daniel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Took everything I've worked 5 years to build. Catherine reached over and touched his good arm. We'll get them back, somehow. Daniel gave her a look that was half gratitude, half despair. With what? I put every penny I had into this place. The cattle were my savings account, my retirement, my future. Without them. He didn't finish the sentence, but Catherine understood. Without his livestock, Daniel would lose the ranch. He'd be right back where he started after the war, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a head full of bad memories. They rode down the hill carefully, Daniel's hand never straying far from his gun, but the ranch appeared truly deserted. Even the chickens were gone, probably taken for food by Brennan's men. Hello, the house, Daniel called out as they approached, just in case anyone was hiding inside. When no answer came, he dismounted and helped Catherine down from her horse. The inside of the house was a mess. Furniture was overturned, dishes broken, papers scattered across the floor. But it wasn't random destruction. It was a message. Brennan wanted Daniel to know he could take whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Look at this, Catherine said, picking up a photograph from the floor. It showed a younger Daniel in a Union Army uniform, standing with a group of other soldiers. One of them looked familiar. That's Marcus, Daniel said, seeing what she was looking at. Second from the left. This was taken just before the Battle of Gettysburg. Catherine studied the faces in the photograph. They all looked so young, so hopeful. It was hard to believe one of them would become a killer and another would become a hermit hiding from the world. What happened between you two? She asked. After the war, I mean. Daniel was quiet for a long time, gathering scattered papers. We came back to a world that didn't know what to do with us. No jobs, no money, no place to fit in. I decided to come west and start over. Marcus decided to take what he thought the world owed him. And you never saw him again? Until yesterday? Once. About 3 years ago, he tried to get me to join his gang. Said we could be partners, take whatever we wanted from the settlers and ranchers. Daniel's voice was bitter. When I said no, he threatened to burn me out. Guess he finally made good on that threat. Catherine set the photograph on the mantelpiece, the only piece of furniture still standing upright. So this is personal. It's not just about the money or the cattle. It's about the fact that I chose a different path, Daniel agreed. And Marcus can't stand that. He wants me to be as twisted and bitter as he is. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the jingle of spurs on the wooden porch. Daniel's hand went to his gun, and he motioned for Catherine to get behind the overturned table. Daniel, a voice called from outside. It wasn't Brennan, but it was familiar. I know you're in there. We need to talk. Daniel frowned, then moved to the window and peered out carefully. "Jake Morrison," he called back. "What are you doing here?" "Can I come in? I'm alone, and I got something important to tell you." Catherine recognized the name. Jake Morrison was Doc Morrison's older brother, a former soldier who'd settled in the territory after the war. She'd heard he ran a small spread about 20 miles east of Daniel's ranch. "Come ahead," Daniel said, but he kept his gun ready. Jake Morrison was a tall man with graying hair and worry lines around his eyes. He looked like he'd been riding hard, and his clothes were dusty from the trail. "Brennan hit my place too," he said without preamble. 3 days ago. Took half my horses and burned my hay barn." Daniel's expression darkened. "Anyone hurt?" "No, thank God. My wife and kids were visiting her sister in Cheyenne." Jake looked around at the destroyed room. "But it's not just you and me, Daniel. He's been hitting ranches all up and down the valley. Small places, mostly. Folks who can't fight back." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "He's not just after Daniel. He's trying to drive everyone out." "That's what I figure," Jake agreed. "Question is, what are we going to do about it? The army's spread too thin to help, and the territorial marshal is 3 days' ride from here." Daniel was quiet for a moment, thinking, how many ranchers has he hit? 7 that I know of. Maybe more. Jake sat heavily in a broken chair. Most of them are talking about packing up and leaving. Can't blame them, really. Hard to make a living when outlaws keep stealing your livelihood. And if everyone leaves, then Brennan gets what he wants. Control of the whole valley. Best grazing land in the territory. Plus water rights to 3 rivers. Catherine began to understand the bigger picture. This wasn't just about revenge or settling old scores. Brennan was trying to build an empire, and he was using fear and violence to clear out anyone who might stand in his way. "There's something else," Jake said quietly. "Word is, Brennan's got backing. Someone with real money is financing his operation." Daniel's head snapped up. "What kind of someone?" "Don't know for sure, but I heard talk about a cattle baron from Texas, man named Richardson, who's been buying up land all through the territory. Could be he's using Brennan to drive down prices, make folks desperate enough to sell cheap." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Jake was right, then they weren't just dealing with a gang of outlaws. They were up against organized crime with deep pockets and political connections. "So what do we do?" Catherine asked. Both men looked at her in surprise, as if they'd forgotten she was there. "We?" Jake said gently. "Miss, this isn't your fight. It became my fight when Brennan tried to kill me," Catherine replied firmly. "Besides, you need all the help you can get." Daniel started to object, but Catherine cut him off. "I'm not going to stand by and watch good people lose everything they've worked for. There has to be something we can do." Jake looked thoughtfully at Daniel. "She's got sand. I'll give her that. Reminds me of my Mary when we first came out here. The question is," Daniel said slowly, "do we run or do we fight?" "I'm tired of running," Jake said. "Spent 4 years running from Confederate cavalry. Don't plan to start running from outlaws now." Catherine felt something fierce and determined rising in her chest. "Then we fight. But we fight smart. We make a plan." As the sun set over the broken ranch, 3 unlikely allies began to plot the downfall of the most dangerous outlaw gang in Wyoming territory. The gunshots shattered the dawn silence like broken glass, and Catherine's eyes snapped open to see Daniel already rolling out of his makeshift bed on the floor, pistol in hand. Through the window, she could see riders approaching fast, at least 6 of them, kicking up dust clouds in the gray morning light. "They found us," Daniel whispered, motioning for Catherine to stay low. Jake Morrison was already at the back window, his rifle ready. They'd spent the night in the ruins of Daniel's house, planning their next move, but it looked like Brennan had other ideas. "Daniel Crenshaw," the voice carried across the yard with cruel amusement. "Come on out, old friend. Time we finished our conversation." Catherine crawled to the front window and peered through a crack in the shutters. Marcus Brennan sat on his horse like a king surveying his kingdom, flanked by 5 other riders. But these weren't the same men from the wagon attack. These looked harder, meaner, like professional killers rather than common outlaws. "New recruits," Jake muttered, seeing the same thing. Word must be spreading that there's money to be made riding with Brennan. Daniel's jaw tightened. The plan they'd worked out the night before, gathering the other ranchers, organizing a proper defense, suddenly seemed impossible. How could farmers and cattlemen fight against trained gunfighters? "I know you're in there, Danny," Brennan called out again. "You and that pretty little witness of yours. Come out peaceful. And maybe we can work something out." Catherine felt ice in her veins. Somehow, Brennan knew she was here, which meant he'd been watching them, tracking their movements. The trap was closing faster than they'd expected. "What's the matter, Daniel?" Brennan's voice took on a mocking tone. "War hero like you should be brave enough to face an old comrade. Or did that Yankee courage of yours die when you started hiding out here like a hermit?" That did it. Daniel started toward the door, but Jake grabbed his arm. "Don't let him bait you. That's what he wants." "I know what he wants," Daniel replied grimly. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Catherine surprised them both by standing up. "We're going to give it to him." "What?" Jake stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Think about it," Catherine said, her mind racing. "He wants Daniel to come out. He wants to finish this face to face. So let's do it, but on our terms, not his." Daniel shook his head. "Catherine, I'm not letting you—" "Listen to me," she interrupted. "Brennan's weakness is his pride. He needs to prove he's better than you, that he made the right choice after the war. Use that against him." Through the window, they could see Brennan growing impatient. His horse was dancing nervously, and his men were looking around for signs of an ambush. "Challenge him to single combat," Catherine continued. "Appeal to whatever honor he has left. Make it about settling old debts, soldier to soldier." Jake frowned. "And while they're fighting, you and I circle around behind them. When Daniel gives the signal, we take out as many as we can before they know what hit them." It was a desperate plan, full of holes and assumptions. But as Daniel looked out at the 6 armed men surrounding his house, he realized they didn't have many other options. "It could work," he said slowly, "if Brennan's pride is as big as I think it is. When this goes wrong, and it will go wrong, you run," Daniel told Catherine firmly. "Promise me, no matter what happens, you get to safety." Catherine looked him in the eye. "I promise to do whatever gives us the best chance of survival. All of us." It wasn't the promise he wanted, but it was the one he got. Daniel checked his gun one more time, then walked to the door. "Marcus," he called out, "you want to settle this? Then let's settle it proper. Just you and me, like the old days." Brennan's laughter carried across the yard. "You challenging me to a duel, Danny? How delightfully old-fashioned." "Call it whatever you want. But if you win, you get everything. The ranch, the woman, the satisfaction of knowing you were right all along. And if you win, you ride out of this territory and never come back. You're men, too." Catherine held her breath as silence stretched across the morning air. She could see Brennan thinking, weighing his options. His men were watching him carefully, waiting to see what their leader would decide. "You know what?" Brennan said finally. "Why not? Been too long since I had some real entertainment." He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "But let's make it interesting. No fancy dueling rules. First man still standing wins." Daniel stepped out onto the porch, and Catherine felt her heart clench. In the morning light, she could see how much the shoulder wound was still bothering him. His left arm hung stiffly at his side, and there were lines of pain around his eyes. "Fair enough," Daniel said. "But the woman stays out of it. Whatever happens between us, she walks away clean." "Oh, she'll walk away all right," Brennan said with that terrible smile. "Question is, how far will she get?" The two men faced each other in the dusty yard, 20 feet apart. Catherine could see the history between them, the friendship that had turned to betrayal, the different paths they'd chosen after the war. This wasn't just about territory or revenge anymore. This was about two men trying to prove their way of life was right. "You ready, Danny?" Brennan asked, his hand hovering over his gun. "Been ready for 3 years," Daniel replied. Time seemed to slow down. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the dust and smoke and fear that hung in the air. Jake was moving toward the back door, getting into position for their desperate plan. Then Brennan's hand moved, and everything exploded into violence. But instead of going for his gun, Brennan dove to one side and shouted, "Take them!" His men opened fire immediately, bullets splintering the porch and shattering windows. Daniel threw himself behind a water trough as lead flew all around him. Catherine realized with horror that Brennan had never intended to fight fair. The challenge had been a trick to get Daniel out in the open where his men could gun him down easily. "So much for honor among soldiers," she muttered, grabbing Jake's spare rifle from where he'd left it by the window. The gunfight was chaos. Brennan's men had spread out, using their horses for cover while they poured bullets into the house. Daniel was pinned behind the water trough, unable to get a clear shot. Jake was returning fire from the back window, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. Catherine knew they were going to lose unless something changed fast. That's when she remembered something Daniel had said about Brennan's weakness, his need to be in control, to be the star of every show. Taking a deep breath, she stood up in full view of the window and shouted, "Marcus Brennan, you yellow-bellied coward!" The shooting stopped abruptly. Every eye in the yard turned toward her. "That's right," she continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "The great Marcus Brennan, so scared of one wounded man that he needs 5 gunfighters to help him. What would your men think if they knew their brave leader was afraid of a fair fight?" Brennan's face twisted with rage. "You little—" "Prove me wrong," Catherine challenged. "Fight him fair and square, unless you're too scared." She was gambling everything on Brennan's pride, betting that his need to look strong in front of his men would override his common sense. For a moment, she thought she'd lost the bet. Then Brennan raised his hand, and his men stopped shooting. "You know what, miss? You're right. I don't need help to deal with one broken-down soldier." He turned to his men. "Back off. Give us room. This is between me and Daniel." Catherine slumped against the wall, shaking with relief and terror. Her desperate gamble had worked, but now Daniel would have to face Brennan in a real gunfight. And she wasn't sure his wounded shoulder would be fast enough to save his life. The silence in the yard felt heavy as a thunderstorm about to break, with Daniel and Brennan facing each other, while death waited between them, like an invisible line neither man wanted to cross first. Catherine pressed herself against the window frame, hardly daring to breathe, as she watched the 2 former soldiers prepare to settle their differences with bullets. "Just like old times, Danny," Brennan said, rolling his shoulders to loosen them up. "Remember that Confederate sharpshooter at Antietam? The one who had us pinned down for 2 hours? Daniel's eyes never left Brennan's gun hand. "I remember you wanted to charge his position head-on. Would have gotten the whole squad killed. And you wanted to wait for reinforcements that never came," Brennan replied. "Always the cautious one, weren't you? Always playing it safe." Catherine could see what Brennan was doing, trying to get into Daniel's head, make him doubt himself. But Daniel seemed calm, focused, like he'd found some inner peace she couldn't understand. "Playing it safe kept our men alive," Daniel said quietly. "Something you never cared much about." Brennan's smile turned ugly. "Our men? You mean your precious Union boys? What about all those Confederate soldiers we killed, Danny? They had families, too. Wives and children waiting for them to come home. That was war. This is murder." "War, murder. What's the difference? Dead is dead, and the winner writes the history books." Catherine realized that Brennan wasn't just trying to distract Daniel. He was trying to justify himself, to make his current life of crime seem like a natural extension of their military service. But she could see from Daniel's expression that the argument wasn't working. "The difference," Daniel said, "is that in war, we fought for something bigger than ourselves. You're just a common thief now, Marcus. Nothing more." That hit home. Brennan's face flushed red, and his hand twitched toward his gun. But he caught himself, forced his temper back under control. "We'll see who's common when this is over," he snarled. The 2 men began to circle each other slowly, like wolves looking for an opening. Catherine noticed that Daniel was favoring his wounded shoulder, holding his left arm close to his body. Brennan saw it too, and his confidence grew. "That shoulder bothering you, old friend? Maybe you should have stayed in bed a few more days." Daniel didn't reply, but Catherine could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The wound was definitely affecting him, slowing his movements. limiting his options. From the corner of her eye, Catherine saw Jake Morrison moving carefully along the side of the house, using the building for cover as he tried to get a better angle on Brennan's men. Their plan was still in motion, but everything depended on Daniel surviving the next few minutes. "Tell you what," Brennan said suddenly. "I'm feeling generous. Surrender now, and I'll make it quick. You and the woman both. Clean bullets to the head, no suffering." "That's real thoughtful of you, Marcus. But I think I'll pass." "Your choice. But when you're lying in the dirt, bleeding out slow, remember that I gave you an easy way out." Catherine's hands tightened on the rifle she was holding. She'd never shot at a human being before, wasn't even sure she could hit anything at this distance. But if things went wrong, she was going to try. The circling continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Both men were looking for the perfect moment, that split second when their opponent would be slightly off balance, slightly distracted, slightly vulnerable. It came when one of Brennan's horses whinnied and shied at something in the grass. Just for an instant, Brennan's eyes flicked toward the sound. Daniel's hand moved like lightning, his gun clearing leather in one smooth motion. But Brennan was fast too, faster than Catherine had expected. Both guns fired at almost the same instant, the sharp cracks echoing off the hills like thunder. Daniel staggered backward, clutching his side. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and wet in the morning sun. But Brennan was on the ground, his gun several feet away, holding his right shoulder and cursing. "Well, I'll be damned," Brennan gasped. "Still got some fight left in you after all." Daniel kept his gun trained on his fallen opponent, though Catherine could see he was struggling to stay upright. "It's over, Marcus. Call off your men." But Brennan was smiling again, that same cold expression that had haunted Catherine's nightmares. "Is it over, Danny? Take a look around." Catherine's blood turned to ice as she realized what he meant. While everyone had been focused on the duel, more riders had appeared on the surrounding hills. She counted at least a dozen, maybe more, all armed and watching the scene below. "Did you really think I'd come here with just 5 men?" Brennan laughed, though the sound was strained with pain. "I've been planning this for months, gathering every gun for hire in 3 territories. You're not just fighting me, old friend. You're fighting an army." Daniel's face went pale as he took in the hopeless odds. Even if he and Jake and Catherine could somehow defeat the men in the yard, there were too many others to fight. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. "Here's my new offer," Brennan said, struggling to sit up. "You and your friends surrender now, and I'll let the woman live. She can work in one of my establishments. Better than being dead, don't you think?" Catherine felt sick to her stomach. She knew what kind of establishments Brennan was talking about, and death would indeed be preferable. "Go to hell," Daniel said, through gritted teeth. "Already been there, Danny. Did my tour during the war, same as you. Difference is, I learned to enjoy it." That's when Catherine heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sound of a bugle call echoing across the valley. The cavalry charge played on a military horn, getting closer by the second. Brennan heard it too, and his confident expression faltered. "What the hell?" Over the nearest hill came a sight that Catherine would remember for the rest of her life. 24 cavalry soldiers in blue uniforms, riding at full gallop with their sabers flashing in the morning sun. Leading them was Sergeant Williams from Fort Laramie, his face grim with determination. "Looks like your army just got bigger too," Daniel said, allowing himself a small smile despite his wound. Brennan's men on the hills were already scattering, unwilling to face trained soldiers in open combat. The gunfighters in the yard looked to their wounded leader for orders, but Brennan was staring at the approaching cavalry with something close to panic. "This isn't over," he snarled, trying to get to his feet. "You think the army can protect you forever? I'll be back, Danny. Next month, next year, I'll be back." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You won't." He raised his gun, and for a moment Catherine thought he was going to shoot an unarmed man, but instead he fired into the air, a signal to the approaching cavalry. The soldiers surrounded the yard in minutes, their weapons trained on Brennan's remaining men. The fight was over, But Catherine realized with growing dread that Daniel was swaying on his feet, his face white with blood loss. "Daniel!" she cried, running toward him as he collapsed to his knees. The last thing she saw before rushing to his side was Marcus Brennan being helped onto a horse by two soldiers, his hands bound behind his back. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Blood soaked through Catherine's dress as she knelt beside Daniel in the dusty yard, pressing her hands against the bullet wound in his side while Sergeant Williams shouted orders to his men. The metallic smell, mixed with gunpowder smoke, made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to stay calm even as Daniel's face grew paler by the minute. "How bad is it?" Daniel whispered, his voice weak but steady. Catherine tried to keep her expression hopeful, but the amount of blood frightening her. "Doc Morrison will fix you up good as new," she said, though she wasn't sure either of them believed it. Sergeant Williams knelt beside them, his weathered face grim as he examined the wound. "We need to get him back to the fort fast. Lost too much blood already." "What about Brennan?" Catherine asked, glancing toward where the outlaw leader sat bound on horseback, surrounded by soldiers. Even captured, he seemed to be enjoying their predicament. "He'll keep," Williams replied curtly. "Right now, your friend here needs a doctor more than we need answers." As the soldiers prepared a makeshift stretcher, Catherine noticed something that made her heart sink. Several of Brennan's men had escaped during the confusion, melting away into the hills like smoke. Including, she realized with growing dread, the ones who'd looked like professional killers, rather than common outlaws. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "some of them got away." Williams nodded grimly. "I know. We'll track them down later. First things first." But Catherine wondered if there would be a later. Brennan's operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, and cutting off the head might not kill the snake. There were still dangerous men out there, and they knew where to find her. The ride back to Fort Laramie took 3 agonizing hours, with Daniel drifting in and out of consciousness despite Catherine's efforts to keep him talking. She rode beside the stretcher, holding his hand and telling him stories about St. Louis, about her childhood, about anything she could think of to keep him focused on her voice. "Catherine," he mumbled during one of his clearer moments, "there's something you need to know. About my ranch. About why I came out here." "Save your strength," she said, squeezing his hand. "You can tell me later when you're better." "No, listen. If something happens to me, there's a box buried under the floorboards in the bedroom. Legal papers. The ranch. I want you to have it." Catherine's throat tightened. "Don't talk like that. You're going to be fine." But Daniel's eyes were already closing again, and she wasn't sure he heard her reply. The rest of the journey passed in tense silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the creak of leather. Doc Morrison was waiting for them at the fort, having been alerted by a rider who'd gone ahead. He took one look at Daniel's condition and immediately began barking orders to his assistants. "Get him into the surgery, heat water, lots of it, and someone find me more clean bandages." Catherine tried to follow, but the doctor stopped her at the door. "You can't help him by getting in my way, miss. Go get yourself cleaned up and let me work." For the next several hours, Catherine paced the small waiting area like a caged animal. Jake Morrison had arrived shortly after them, having rounded up several other ranchers who'd been hit by Brennan's gang. They sat in grim silence, their faces reflecting the same worry Catherine felt. "How long does surgery usually take?" asked Tom Patterson, whose cattle had been stolen 2 weeks earlier. "Depends on how deep the bullet went," Jake replied. "Could be hours yet." Catherine stared out the window at the fort's parade ground, where normal life continued despite the crisis. Soldiers drilled, women hung laundry, children played games in the dust. It seemed impossible that the world could keep turning when Daniel's life hung in the balance. "Miss Moreau?" A young soldier appeared at her elbow. "Sergeant Williams wants to see you. Says it's important." Catherine reluctantly followed the soldier to the fort's main office, where she found Williams sitting across from a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed, with soft hands and expensive boots that had never seen honest work. "Catherine, this is Mr. Richardson," Williams said. "He represents certain business interests in the territory." The name hit Catherine like a physical blow. Richardson, the cattle baron Jake had mentioned. the one supposedly backing Brennan's operation. What was he doing here, talking to the army? Miss Moreau, Richardson said smoothly, rising to shake her hand. I'm terribly sorry about your ordeal. These outlaw attacks are becoming far too common in our territory. Catherine studied his face, looking for any sign of guilt or deception. But Richardson seemed genuinely concerned, even sympathetic. Either he was innocent or he was a very good actor. Mr. Richardson has offered to help track down the remaining members of Brennan's gang, Williams explained. He's got resources we don't. Private investigators. Connections with other ranchers. That's very generous, Catherine said carefully. Why would you go to such trouble? Richardson's smile was warm and seemingly honest. Because lawlessness is bad for business, Miss Moreau. I've invested heavily in this territory's future. Cattle rustlers and murderers are a threat to all of us. Something about his answer bothered Catherine, though she couldn't put her finger on what. Maybe it was too smooth, too rehearsed, or maybe she was just looking for enemies where none existed. There's something else, Williams continued. We've had word from the territorial capital. The governor wants a full investigation into Brennan's activities. That means you'll need to give testimony, Miss Moreau. Formal testimony that could be used in court. Catherine's blood chilled. Court? You mean a trial? Eventually, yes. Brennan's going to hang for what he's done. But we need witnesses to make sure the charges stick. But that means... Catherine's voice trailed off as the implications hit her. A trial meant publicity, newspapers, her name and face known throughout the territory. And it meant that anyone wanting revenge for Brennan's capture would know exactly where to find her. Don't worry, Richardson said, seeming to read her thoughts. I can arrange protection for you. Private guards, safe houses, whatever you need. Catherine looked between the two men, feeling trapped. On one hand, she wanted justice for Daniel and all the other victims of Brennan's gang. On the other hand, testifying could make her a target for the rest of her life. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Williams replied. But don't take too long. The territorial prosecutor wants to move fast before any more evidence disappears. As Catherine left the meeting, her mind was spinning with new worries. The capture of Brennan should have meant safety, but instead it felt like the beginning of a whole new kind of danger. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the figure waiting for her outside the doctor's office, a woman about her own age, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a simple but well-made dress. Miss Moreau? I'm Mary Morrison, Jake's wife. I came as soon as I heard. Catherine felt a rush of relief at meeting another woman, someone who might understand her fears and confusion. Is there any news about Daniel? Mary's expression was cautiously hopeful. Doc says the surgery went well. Bullet missed anything vital, and there's no sign of infection yet. He should pull through, though it'll be a long recovery. Catherine felt tears of relief threatening. Can I see him? He's sleeping now, but Doc says you can sit with him for a few minutes. As they walked toward the recovery room, Mary surprised Catherine by taking her arm. Jake told me what you did today, how you stood up to those outlaws, helped plan the fight. That took real courage. I was terrified the whole time, Catherine admitted. Courage isn't about not being scared, Mary said gently. It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. And from what I hear, you've got plenty of that. Catherine found Daniel propped up in bed, his chest wrapped in clean bandages, but his color much better than it had been. His eyes opened when she entered, and he managed a weak smile. How are you feeling? She asked, taking the chair beside his bed. Like I've been shot, Daniel replied, his voice hoarse but tinged with humor. But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to the cavalry. And Jake's good shooting. No, Daniel said, reaching for her hand. Thanks to you having the guts to challenge Brennan when he was going to kill us all. You saved my life, Catherine. Again. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. I just did what needed doing. That's what makes you special, Daniel said quietly. You see what needs doing, and you do it, no matter how scared you are. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, just grateful to be alive and together. But then, Daniel's expression grew serious. Catherine, there's something we need to talk about. Something about what happens next. What do you mean? Daniel looked out the window at the setting sun. Brennan's captured, but his operation is still out there. And now that you're going to testify against him, you're going to be a target for anyone looking to settle scores." Catherine had been trying not to think about that particular problem. "I know. But what choice do I have? If I don't testify, he might go free." "There is another choice," Daniel said slowly. "You could disappear. New name, new life, somewhere far from here. I've got enough money saved to get you started." The offer hung in the air between them like an unspoken question. Catherine realized that Daniel was giving her a way out, not just from the danger, but from him, from the complicated feelings that had grown between them during their time together. "And what about you?" she asked. "What happens to you if I disappear?" Daniel's smile was sad but determined. "I go back to my ranch, rebuild what was burned, live the quiet life I always wanted." "Alone? If that's what it takes to keep you safe, then yes, alone." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, seeing the sacrifice he was willing to make for her safety. But she also saw something else, the same loneliness that had driven him to live like a hermit for 5 years, the same fear of connection that had kept him isolated from the world. "No," she said firmly. "Catherine, no," she repeated. "I'm not running away, and I'm not letting you go back to hiding from life. We've come too far for that." Daniel's eyes searched her face. "What are you saying?" Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "I'm saying that we face this together. All of it. The trial, the danger, whatever comes next. Together." For the first time since she'd known him, Daniel Crenshaw looked genuinely surprised. And then, slowly, he began to smile. Winter came early to Wyoming territory that year, bringing with it a blizzard that buried the landscape under 3 feet of snow and trapped Catherine and Daniel together in his rebuilt cabin. The isolation that had once defined Daniel's existence now felt different, warmer, filled with quiet conversations and shared meals as they waited for spring to return. Catherine had grown stronger during the months of recovery, both physically and emotionally. The terrified young woman who'd left St. Louis seemed like a different person now. She could shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy, tend livestock, and had even learned to read the weather signs that warned of approaching storms. "Tell me about your family," Catherine said one evening as they sat by the fire, Daniel whittling a new chair leg while she mended his shirts. "Before the war, I mean." Daniel's hands stilled on the wood. "Not much to tell. Pa was a carpenter in Ohio. Ma took in washing. I was their only child who lived past infancy. They died of cholera while I was fighting in Virginia." "I'm sorry," Catherine said softly. "That must have been awful, coming home to nothing." "It was one of the reasons I came west. Nothing left for me back there." Daniel resumed his whittling, the gentle scraping sound mixing with the wind outside. "What about your parents?" "Ma was a seamstress, like me. Pa liked to drink more than he liked to work. Ma did her best to keep food on the table and clothes on our backs." Catherine's voice grew distant. "She used to tell me stories about ladies in fine houses, wearing beautiful dresses. Said maybe someday I'd make dresses for women like that." "Maybe you still will," Daniel said, "when this is all over." Catherine looked around the simple cabin, rough-hewn logs, plain furniture, nothing fancy or elegant, but it felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. "I think I found something better than fine ladies in beautiful dresses," she said. Before Daniel could respond, a sound from outside made them both freeze. Hoofbeats coming through the snow. At this time of year, in this weather, no one traveled unless it was life or death. Daniel reached for his rifle, motioning for Catherine to blow out the lamp. In the darkness, they waited as the sounds grew closer, multiple horses, moving carefully through the drifts. "Hello, the house," a familiar voice called out. "It's Jake Morrison. Got news from town." Daniel relaxed slightly, but kept his weapon ready as he opened the door. Jake Morrison stood on the porch, snow-covered and shivering, with 2 other men Catherine didn't recognize. "Get inside before you freeze to death," Daniel said, stepping aside. "What brings you out in weather like this?" Jake stomped the snow off his boots, his expression grim. "Brennan escaped." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. "How? When?" 3 days ago. There was a jailbreak in Cheyenne. Someone on the inside helped him, and 5 other prisoners get out. Jake accepted the cup of hot coffee Catherine poured for him. But that's not the worst of it. There's worse? Daniel asked. Richardson's dead. Shot in his hotel room 2 nights ago, and his lawyer disappeared, along with all the papers from his investigation into Brennan's operation. Catherine sank into a chair, her mind reeling. Richardson had seemed like such a solid, respectable businessman. His death changed everything. You think Brennan killed him? She asked. Don't know for sure, Jake replied. But the timing's mighty suspicious. And there's something else. Word is, Richardson wasn't quite the honest businessman he pretended to be. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Turns out he was buying up land all right, but not always legal-like. Forged deeds, bribed officials, that sort of thing. Some folks are saying he and Brennan were partners, not enemies. Catherine remembered her uneasy feeling about Richardson during their meeting at the fort. Her instincts had been right. There had been something false about his smooth concern. So, what does that mean for us? Daniel asked. Jake looked uncomfortable. It means the territorial prosecutor doesn't have much of a case anymore. Main witness is dead, evidence is missing, and without Richardson's testimony about the bigger conspiracy. Brennan might go free, Catherine finished. Even if they catch him again, yeah, he's covered his tracks pretty well. Catherine stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the swirling snow. Somewhere out there, Marcus Brennan was free, and probably planning his revenge. All their sacrifice, all their courage, and he was still going to win. There's something else, Jake said quietly. Something you need to know, Catherine. She turned back to face him, seeing sympathy in his eyes. There's a bounty on your head, $500 for whoever brings you in alive. Words spreading through every saloon and outlaw camp in 3 territories. Daniel's face went white. 500? That's enough to bring every gunslinger and bounty hunter from here to California. Catherine felt strangely calm, as if she'd been expecting this news. How long do we have? Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how fast word spreads and how brave folks are feeling. Daniel was already moving, checking weapons, calculating supplies. We need to leave. Tonight. Get to somewhere defensible until this blows over. Where? Catherine asked. Brennan's got connections everywhere. And now that Richardson's dead, we don't know who else might be working with him. What about the army? Jake suggested. Surely they'd protect a witness. Daniel shook his head. Army's got its own problems. Besides, they can't spare men to guard one person indefinitely. Catherine listened to them debate options, but her mind was working on a different problem entirely. Running and hiding might keep her alive for a while, but it wouldn't solve anything. Brennan would still be out there, still terrorizing innocent people, still building his criminal empire. No, she said suddenly. Both men stopped talking and looked at her. I'm not running anymore, Catherine continued. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting him control my life. Catherine, Daniel said gently, this isn't about courage. This is about staying alive. Is it? Or is it about letting evil win because good people are too scared to fight back? She moved to the gun cabinet and took out the rifle Daniel had been teaching her to use. You said yourself that Brennan's operation is bigger than just him. Even if we run, even if we hide, he'll keep hurting people. The only way this ends is if someone stops him. Daniel's expression was a mixture of admiration and terror. What are you proposing? Catherine checked the rifle's action, surprised by how natural it felt in her hands now. I'm proposing we stop running and start hunting. Brennan wants me. Fine. Let's give him the chance to try and take me. That's suicide, Jake protested. Maybe, Catherine agreed, but it's also the only way to end this for good. And frankly, I'd rather die fighting than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing her words against his desire to protect her. Finally, he sighed and reached for his own rifle. All right, he said. If we're going to do this, we do it smart. We choose the ground, we choose the time, and we make sure we have backup. Jake shook his head in disbelief. You're both crazy. Probably, Catherine agreed. But sometimes crazy is the only sane response to an insane situation. As they began planning what might be their final battle, Catherine felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she knew exactly who she was and what she was fighting for. Not just survival, but the right to build a life worth living. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen prairie, carrying with it the promise of spring and the threat of violence. But inside the warm cabin, three friends prepared to face whatever came next, together. The trap was set like a spider's web in the ruins of the old mining camp, with Catherine walking alone down the main street, while Daniel and Jake positioned themselves in abandoned buildings on either side. Her footsteps echoed off broken wooden sidewalks as she made her way toward the saloon, where she'd arranged to meet Marcus Brennan face to face. "You sure about this, Catherine?" Daniel's voice came through the speaking tube they'd rigged between buildings, barely audible but filled with concern. Catherine touched the small mirror signal device hidden in her coat pocket. "As sure as I can be about anything anymore." The mining camp had been perfect for their plan. Isolated enough that innocent people wouldn't get hurt, but with enough cover and escape routes to give them fighting chances. Most importantly, it was neutral ground where Brennan might actually agree to meet. Catherine pushed through the saloon's swinging doors, her heart hammering as she stepped into the dusty interior. Broken chairs and tables littered the floor, and cobwebs hung from the chandelier like funeral shrouds. But she wasn't alone. Marcus Brennan sat at a table in the far corner, looking remarkably clean and well-dressed for a man who'd recently escaped from prison. Two other men flanked him, hard-faced gunfighters who watched Catherine with the cold eyes of professional killers. "Well, well," Brennan said, rising with mock courtesy. "The famous Catherine Moreau, the woman who's caused me so much trouble." Catherine fought to keep her voice steady. "You're the one who's caused trouble, Marcus, for a lot of innocent people." "Innocent?" Brennan laughed, gesturing for her to sit across from him. "Nobody's innocent in this territory, sweetheart. We're all just trying to survive and get ahead." Catherine remained standing, her hand close to the gun, hidden under her coat. "Is that what you tell yourself? That murdering and stealing is just survival?" "It's being realistic about human nature. The strong take from the weak. That's how the world works." Brennan's eyes glittered with cruel amusement. "You should understand that better than most. After all, you came out here running from your own problems." The words stung because they held a grain of truth. Catherine had come west to escape her past, to run from shame and disappointment. But she'd learned something important since then. "You're right," she said, surprising him. "I did come here running. But running taught me something you never learned." "And what's that?" "That you can run towards something better, or you can run towards something worse. You chose worse." Brennan's smile faded. "Pretty words, but words don't stop bullets. And I've got plenty of those." That's when Catherine heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of more horses approaching the camp. Through the dirty window, she could see riders surrounding the buildings where Daniel and Jake were hiding. "Did you really think I'd come here alone?" Brennan asked, following her gaze. "I've got 12 men out there, and they all know what to do if this conversation doesn't go the way I want." Catherine's throat tightened. The trap had been turned against them. Instead of catching Brennan, they'd walked into his web. "What do you want?" she asked. "Simple. You're going to write a letter confessing that you lied about seeing me at the wagon attack, that you made the whole thing up for attention. And then, you're going to disappear permanently. And if I don't?" Brennan nodded toward the window. "Then your friends out there die real slow, and you get to watch." Catherine felt despair creeping over her like cold water. They'd been so careful with their plan, but Brennan had outthought them. He'd played the game longer and better than they had. But then she remembered something Daniel had taught her about reading people, that desperate men make mistakes, and Brennan's need for her confession meant he was more desperate than he wanted to admit. "Why do you need the letter?" she asked. "If you're going to kill me anyway, why does it matter what I say?" For just a moment, Brennan's confident mask slipped. "Because there are still people asking questions, important people who might cause problems if this doesn't get wrapped up neat and clean." Catherine realized that Brennan's criminal empire was more fragile than it appeared. He needed her dead, But he also needed it to look legal and justified, which meant he wasn't as powerful as he pretended to be. "You're scared," she said, the understanding hitting her like lightning. "Someone's putting pressure on you. Someone bigger than you are." Brennan's face darkened. "I'm not scared of anything." "Then why are you hiding in abandoned buildings instead of ruling your territory like the king you claim to be?" The gunfighter to Brennan's left shifted nervously. Catherine saw the movement and realized these men weren't as loyal as they appeared. They were hired guns, probably wondering if their boss was strong enough to protect them from whatever threat was making him so desperate. "You know what I think?" Catherine continued, sensing weakness. "I think Richardson's death brought attention you don't want. I think there are federal marshals asking questions, maybe even Pinkerton agents. And I think you need my death to look like justice instead of murder." Brennan stood up abruptly, his hand moving to his gun. "Enough talking. Write the letter." But Catherine had seen something in his eyes that gave her hope. Fear. Real, genuine fear of consequences he couldn't control with bullets and intimidation. "No," she said simply. "No?" Brennan's voice cracked with surprise. "You heard me. I'm not writing anything. If you want me dead, you'll have to murder me in cold blood. And then you'll have to explain to those federal agents why an unarmed woman had to die." The silence in the saloon stretched like a held breath. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat and the nervous breathing of the gunfighters. Outside, a horse whinnied, and someone coughed. That's when she heard something else. Something Brennan couldn't hear from where he stood. The subtle creak of floorboards overhead. So quiet it might have been the building settling. But Catherine knew better. Daniel and Jake hadn't been caught. They'd escaped Brennan's trap and were moving into position for a trap of their own. "Last chance," Brennan said, drawing his gun. "Write the letter or watch your friends die." Catherine smiled, and the expression seemed to unnerve him more than her defiance had. "You know what, Marcus? You're right about one thing. The strong do take from the weak. But you made one mistake." "What's that?" "You assumed I was weak?" The gunfight exploded around them as Daniel and Jake opened fire from the second floor, catching Brennan's men in a crossfire they hadn't expected. Catherine dove behind the bar as bullets shattered bottles and mirrors above her head. Brennan was shouting orders, but his men were already scattering. Some ran for the door, others tried to return fire, but they'd been caught off guard and were fighting blind. Through the chaos, Catherine saw her chance. Brennan was focused on the gunfight, his back to her as he tried to coordinate his men's response. She pulled out her hidden pistol and took careful aim. "Marcus," she called out. He spun around, and their eyes met across the smoky saloon. For a moment, time seemed frozen, the farm girl from St. Louis facing the killer who'd tried to destroy her life. "This is for everyone you hurt," Catherine said, and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the saloon like thunder, and Marcus Brennan fell backward against the wall, clutching his chest. His gun clattered to the floor as he slid down, leaving a trail of blood on the wooden boards. Catherine kept her weapon trained on him as the gunfight raged around them, but she could see he was finished. The man who'd terrorized the territory was dying, and he knew it. You actually did it," he gasped, looking at her with something that might have been respect. "I had to," Catherine replied. "Someone had to." Brennan's laugh turned into a cough that brought up blood. "Federal marshals. They're coming anyway. Richardson wasn't the only one asking questions." "Good," Catherine said. "Maybe they'll clean up the rest of your operation." Brennan's eyes were growing dim, but he managed one last cruel smile. "Rest of my operation? You think this was about money?" Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the broken windows. "What do you mean?" But Marcus Brennan was beyond answering, his eyes fixed on something beyond the ceiling, and his breathing stopped. The gunfight was ending too. Most of Brennan's men were dead or fled, and the saloon fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the settling of dust and the ringing in Catherine's ears. Daniel appeared at her side, his face grim but relieved. "Are you hurt?" Catherine shook her head, still staring at Brennan's body. "He said something at the end, about this not being about money. What else would it be about?" Catherine looked around the destroyed saloon, at the bodies scattered across the floor, at the man she'd killed to protect the people she loved. "I don't know." but I have a feeling we're about to find out. Dawn broke over the prairie 3 days later with the sound of approaching riders, and Catherine felt her heart sink as she recognized the blue uniforms of federal marshals cresting the hill. She stood on the porch of Daniel's rebuilt cabin, watching a dozen lawmen ride toward them with the grim efficiency of men on serious business. Miss Catherine Moreau? The lead marshal was a tall man with gray hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. I'm Marshal Coleman. We need to talk. Catherine felt Daniel's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, but she knew this conversation would determine their future. About Marcus Brennan? Among other things. Marshal Coleman dismounted slowly, his movements careful and measured. May we come inside? This isn't a discussion for open ground. Once they were seated around Daniel's kitchen table, Coleman pulled out a thick folder and spread several documents across the wooden surface. Catherine's heart jumped when she saw her own name on several of the papers. Miss Moreau, what do you know about your father's business dealings? Coleman asked without preamble. Catherine blinked in confusion. My father? He was a drunk who could barely hold a job. What does he have to do with anything? Coleman exchanged glances with his deputy. Your father, Thomas Moreau, wasn't just a drunk, miss. He was also a government informant. He worked for us for nearly 10 years, gathering information about Confederate sympathizers during and after the war. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. That's impossible. My father never did anything important in his life. On the contrary, he was quite valuable to us. The drinking, the job problems, all of it was cover for his real work. Coleman pulled out a photograph that made Catherine gasp. It showed her father shaking hands with a man in a military uniform, both of them looking serious and official. The problem, Coleman continued, is that your father discovered something that got him killed. He'd infiltrated a group of former Confederate officers who were planning to restart the war through criminal activities. Robbery, murder, terrorism, anything to destabilize the federal government's control of the Western territories. Daniel leaned forward. Are you saying Brennan was part of this group? Brennan was a lieutenant in the organization. The real leader was someone much more dangerous. Coleman pulled out another photograph, and Catherine's blood turned to ice. It was Richardson, the cattle baron, but he was wearing a Confederate colonel's uniform and standing with a group of other officers. Richardson wasn't trying to stop Brennan, Catherine whispered. He was his boss. Exactly. And when your father got too close to the truth, they arranged for him to have an accident, made it look like he fell down drunk and hit his head. Catherine felt tears burning her eyes. Her father hadn't been the worthless drunk she'd always believed him to be. He'd been a hero, fighting for his country in secret, and he died for it. But why come after me, she asked. I didn't know anything about his work. Coleman's expression grew sympathetic. Because they were afraid he might have told you something, or left you some kind of evidence. When you suddenly left St. Louis and headed west, right into their territory, they panicked. So the attack on the wagon train was specifically to capture you. Everything else was just cover. Coleman pulled out one more document, a wanted poster with Catherine's face on it. They've been hunting you for months, miss. The bounty, the attempts on your life, all of it was because they thought you might expose their organization. Catherine sank back in her chair, overwhelmed by the revelations. Her entire journey west, everything that had happened to her, had been orchestrated by enemies she hadn't even known existed. But it's over now, Daniel said. Brennan's dead. Richardson's dead. The organization is finished. Coleman shook his head grimly. I'm afraid not. Brennan and Richardson were just two pieces of a much larger puzzle. We estimate there are at least 50 active members spread across 6 territories, and they've been building towards something big. What kind of something? Catherine asked. We're not sure, but our agents have intercepted communications about a major operation planned for this spring, something they're calling the Restoration. Catherine felt cold dread settling in her stomach. And you think I'm still in danger? I know you are. The death of Brennan and Richardson has only made the others more desperate. They'll keep coming after you until they're certain you can't threaten them. Daniel's jaw tightened. So what do you propose, that we spend the rest of our lives running from ghosts? Coleman leaned forward intently. Actually, I have a different proposal. We want you to help us finish this, Miss Moreau. Help you how? By letting us use you as bait. We'll spread word that you've remembered something important about your father's work, something that could expose the entire organization. When they come for you, we'll be ready." Catherine stared at the marshal in disbelief. "You want me to paint an even bigger target on my back? I want to end this threat once and for all. For you, for the territory, for everyone these people have hurt." Coleman's voice was earnest. "Miss Moreau, you've already proven you have the courage to face killers and win. This would be one last fight, but with the full backing of the federal government." Catherine looked at Daniel, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They could run, could disappear somewhere far from Wyoming territory, and try to build a quiet life. But the shadow of her father's enemies would always hang over them. "What would we have to do?" Daniel asked. "Make it known that Catherine is staying at a specific location, somewhere we can control and defend. Then wait for them to come to us." Coleman spread out a map of the territory. "We've identified a ranch house about 50 miles north of here, isolated but with good sightlines and multiple escape routes. We'd have 20 agents positioned around the area." Catherine studied the map, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on her. This could end the threat forever, but it could also get them all killed. "There's something else," Coleman added quietly. "Your father left something for you, evidence he'd gathered about the organization's plans. We've been holding it until we could find you and determine if you were ready to know the truth." He pulled out a leather journal and set it on the table. Catherine's breath caught as she recognized her father's handwriting on the cover. "What does it say?" she whispered. "See for yourself." With trembling hands, Catherine opened the journal and began to read. What she found there changed everything she thought she knew about her father, her past, and her future. The last entry was dated just days before his death. "If something happens to me, Catherine must know that she carries more than my blood. She carries the hopes of everyone who believes in a free and united America. I pray she finds the strength to finish what I started." Catherine closed the journal and looked up at Marshal Coleman. "When do we start?" 5 years had passed since the final battle at Devil's Canyon, and Catherine Crenshaw stood on the porch of her home, watching the sun paint the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson. The ranch that had once been Daniel's lonely retreat now bustled with life. Children's laughter echoed from the barn where her twin daughters were helping their father with the evening chores, while smoke rose from the chimney of the guest house where Jake and Mary Morrison had built their retirement home. The journal her father had left her sat open on the porch table, its pages now familiar friends rather than shocking revelations. She'd read his final words countless times, but tonight they carried special meaning. Tomorrow, she would travel to Cheyenne to speak at the dedication of the Federal Law Enforcement Academy, where new agents would learn the lessons written in blood across the Wyoming territory. "Mama!" 7-year-old Emma came running from the barn, her dark hair flying behind her like a banner. "Papa says dinner's ready, and he made your favorite cornbread." Catherine smiled, scooping her daughter into her arms. Emma had inherited Daniel's steady determination and Catherine's fierce independence, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. "Did you help with the cornbread?" Catherine asked, carrying Emma toward the house. "I helped measure the flour, and I only spilled a little bit." Through the kitchen window, Catherine could see Daniel setting the table while their other daughter, Sarah, arranged wildflowers in a mason jar. The scene was so perfectly domestic that it still sometimes took her breath away, this life she'd never dared to imagine during those dark days of running and fighting. The final confrontation with the Confederate conspiracy had lasted 3 days and claimed the lives of 6 federal agents, but it had ended the threat that had shadowed Catherine since leaving St. Louis. Marshal Coleman had been right. Using her as bait had drawn the remaining conspirators into the open, where justice could finally catch up with them. "Catherine?" Daniel's voice called from inside. "There's someone here to see you." Catherine set Emma down and walked into the kitchen, where she found a young woman about her own age waiting nervously by the door. She was travel-worn and thin, with the same desperate hope in her eyes that Catherine remembered seeing in her own mirror years ago. "Mrs. Crenshaw? I'm Anna Peterson. I heard about what you did, how you fought back against the Outlaws." The woman's voice shook slightly. I was wondering if you might have room for one more person here. I can work, I can cook and clean. I just need somewhere safe to start over. Catherine looked at Anna Peterson and saw herself, young, scared, carrying secrets and shame that felt too heavy to bear alone. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and took the woman's hands. "Of course we have room," Catherine said warmly. "There's always room for someone ready to build a new life." As they sat down to dinner, Catherine listened to Anna's story, another tale of violence and loss, of a woman forced to flee everything she'd known in search of something better. It was a story Catherine had heard many times over the years, as word of the Crenshaw Ranch had spread throughout the territory as a place where broken people could find healing. "Tell us about the Academy speech," Daniel said as they finished Mary's apple pie. "What are you planning to say to those new agents?" Catherine considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought her from that broken wagon in the dust to this warm kitchen, surrounded by family and friends. "I think I'll tell them about courage," she said finally. "Not the kind you see in storybooks, where heroes are never afraid. Real courage. The kind that means doing what's right even when you're terrified, even when you don't know if you're strong enough." Emma looked up from her plate. "Like when you face the bad man?" "Like when anyone faces their bad man," Catherine replied. "Everyone has something they're afraid of, something that tries to keep them from becoming who they're meant to be. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and choosing to fight anyway." Later, after the children were asleep and Anna had been settled in the guest room, Catherine and Daniel sat on the porch swing, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, promising another good growing season. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly. "Choosing this life instead of something easier?" Catherine considered the question seriously. She could have disappeared after the conspiracy was broken, could have taken Marshall Coleman's offer of relocation to a big city back east. She could have married well, lived quietly, raised children who never knew their mother had once killed a man to protect the people she loved. "Never," she said, reaching for his hand. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live, even with all the hardship, all the danger, especially because of that." Catherine smiled, thinking of Anna Peterson upstairs, probably lying awake wondering if she'd finally found sanctuary. Easy lives don't teach you who you really are, and they don't give you the chance to help other people discover who they really are. Daniel squeezed her hand. "Your father would be proud." "I think he would, not because I became someone important or famous, but because I learned to use my strength to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." As they sat in comfortable silence, Catherine thought about the letter she'd received that morning from Marshall Coleman. Crime was down throughout the territory, he'd written. The network of former Confederates had been broken completely, and new settlements were growing every year as word spread that Wyoming was safe for honest folks. But more than that, Coleman had written about the example Catherine had set, the way her story had inspired other victims to fight back, other communities to stand together against lawlessness. The Crenshaw Ranch had become a symbol of something important, the idea that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they found the courage to try. "Mrs. Crenshaw?" Anna Peterson's voice came softly from the doorway. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't sleep. I keep thinking this is too good to be true, that something will go wrong." Catherine stood and walked to the young woman, seeing her own past fears reflected in Anna's eyes. "I understand that feeling. I lived with it for a long time. How did you make it stop?" Catherine looked out at the vast expanse of prairie, at the endless sky that had once seemed threatening but now felt like freedom itself. "By realizing that I was worth fighting for, that everyone is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the best way to heal your own wounds is to help other people heal theirs." Anna was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you really think I can start over? Become someone different?" "I think," Catherine said gently, "that you can become who you were always meant to be. The person you were before fear and pain convinced you to be smaller." As Anna went back inside, Catherine returned to the porch swing where Daniel was waiting. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, her speech in Cheyenne, the constant work of running a ranch that served as refuge for lost souls, the never-ending task of building something good in a harsh land. But tonight, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and the life she'd fought to create, Catherine Moreau Crenshaw felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who'd found her true calling. She'd started her journey as a frightened girl, fleeing shame and disappointment. She'd become a woman who knew that her worth wasn't determined by society's judgment, but by her own resilience and the authentic connections she'd forged. The Wyoming territory was still wild, still dangerous, still beautiful in its unforgiving way. But it was home, not just for her and Daniel, but for everyone brave enough to believe in the possibility of starting over, of becoming better than they'd ever dared to hope. And in the end, Catherine realized that was the greatest courage of all, the courage to hope, to build, to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. It was a lesson written in the scars she carried and the love she'd found, a lesson she would carry forward for as long as she drew breath under the vast Wyoming sky. The echo of that courage would ripple outward long after she was gone, inspiring others to find their own strength, their own worth, their own reason to keep fighting for something better. And that, Catherine knew, was the most important legacy anyone could leave behind.